Here we are yet again, folks. It's that time of the year. Time for another rendition of games under 5 hours. You all know the drill. I found a bunch of indie games under 5 hours long, and now I'm gonna tell you why you should spend the weekend playing them. And this time around, it's time for some real vibers. It might be a horror game, it might be a drama, it might just be a murder mystery, but no matter what, these games are one and all masters of setting and maintaining a compelling tone for you to soak in. Before we get to those, however, we're gonna cover something a little different and check out the strategy deck builder, Trials of Fire. It wouldn't be a quarterly wrap-up without some form of deck builder making it onto the list. These games are popping up everywhere this year. I actually ended up checking out 2 this quarter, and while Roguebook has a lot of interesting twists on the genre, it's in no way a game that gives you the full experience up front and requires you to grind a bit to see its most interesting ideas, so it's difficult to recommend if you're tight on time. Luckily, Trials of Fire has some similar ideas while being much kinder to the time-strapped player. Much like Roguebook, you're not in control of a single character, but managing a full party of companions, each with their own unique and separate deck. And also much like Roguebook, the standard choose-your-corridor overworld of most deck builders has been replaced by a hex grid dotted with points of interest for you to explore. But Trials of Fire takes it one step further and plays like an old-school RPG. Instead of all lining up like it's the Revolutionary War and hoping you have enough block cards to tank the opponent's damage, you get dropped onto a nifty battlefield and engage in some turn-based strategy combat. Cards let you move around the battlefield and take all your different unique actions, which can be anything from taunting the enemy, to sniping them from across the map, to sending out a lightning spell that randomly just smites enemies no matter where they are on the board. It also comes with a really interesting action economy, where in order to build mana for one character to use their abilities, you need to discard cards from other characters' decks, so you're forced to pick and choose which character you want to have a big turn. You can also discard unwanted cards for additional movement and armor, and when you combine all these different options, even the most useless, unwanted, or unaffordable card becomes a useful, multifunctional tool that you have to consider how to use with care. There is a lot going on here, and it's all great. The RPG treatment extends to the progression side of the game as well. Trials of Fire has you developing your deck in one of 2 ways. Anytime a character levels up, they can replace one of their core class cards with a better one. And then there's an entire gear system where you can give your characters equipment that also contributes cards to a character's deck. When you multiply that by 3 party members, there are a lot of different ways to sculpt the perfect fighting force, which might sound a little overwhelming, but in truth, I never found myself having to make any particularly difficult or interesting decisions here. You mostly just pick an archetype for each character and snag cards and equipment that support that archetype. You need a balanced party to survive, so you need to pick which role each character is going to fill early on and build towards it, which doesn't leave a whole lot of room for creativity or depth in the deck building. But that said, once all these different archetypes hit the combat board, they're all pretty dang fun to play. I might be a little bit whelmed by the deck building elements, but there's still a fun way to go about leveling up an RPG party, and the moment-to-moment gameplay on the combat board more than makes up for any deficiencies on the deck building side. And while it might not feature as heavily as some of the other games on this list, Trials of Fire does have a fairly unique vibe for a deck builder. It has all these little setting details about its post-apocalyptic world that mostly keep out of the way so you can focus on the gameplay, but still gesture towards somebody on the team having a lore book thicker than the Silmarillion. Combined with the art style and all the other RPG elements, Trials of Fire feels a lot like slipping into somebody's homebrew AD&D universe, and I have to admit, it's a pretty comfortable and easy fit. And then we finally get to the game's different game modes, and here's where the game becomes particularly friendly to time-strapped players. The game's standard mode will run you the usual 2 to 3 hours most deck builders ask of your time, but Trials of Fire comes with numerous other modes, including specific quests with their own narratives and runtimes, and one mode that you can finish in just an hour. Trials of Fire gives you a ton of different ways you can enjoy the game, whether you want to get lost in an epic-length, custom-made quest, or want to blast through something short and sweet. But no matter how you decide you want to play it, Trials of Fire is a fascinating little strategy gem. Overboard. Overboard is a tiny side project that Inkle, the studio behind 80 Days and Heaven's Vault, popped out between bigger titles. It puts you through a classic murder mystery, a cruise liner bound for America, a cast of quirky and suspicious characters, and a midnight murder. The big twist is that you're the one who did the deed, and instead of trying to figure out who murdered your husband, you have to lay the groundwork to pin it on somebody else. Unfortunately, Mrs. Villainzy is a bit of a sloppy opportunist, so you've got a lot of cleaning up to do. Witnesses to silence, evidence to get rid of, maybe even another murder or 2 if someone doesn't want to cooperate. And you only have 8 hours to do it all. Every action in Overboard, no matter how small, eats up some of your time. Want to move to another cabin? That'll take 10 minutes right there. Need to know what this guy's deal is? He'll be happy to spend 2 hours telling you. Captain wants to get frisky? Do you really have time for that when there's a murder to clean up? Talk to God? In this time economy? Are you crazy? You might not get off scot-free in your first go-around in Overboard, but the time restraints mean that each loop pretty reliably only takes 30 minutes, and that's if you're reading everything and not choosing old dialogue options. Suffice it to say, this is a pretty bite-sized game, but those first few runs are genuinely pretty nerve-wracking as you try to figure out who knows what you've done and who you can trust. Overboard's a highly entertaining little narrative puzzler, but its biggest strength is easily its tone. You've got all the classic murder mystery trappings, a whole cast of stuffy Brits cattily trying to get one over each other, and even God running color commentary on the whole thing. The game is mischief in a bottle, and it knows it. The tone is executed to perfection. And I just love that this game exists. You don't usually see game studios not named Bithell Games decide to spend the time and resources putting out a silly little side project like this, what with all the time and polish it takes to get even a well-formed and simple idea ready for release. But projects like Overboard are as cool as they are rare, and their status as quirky side projects often makes them both unique and extremely concise. Quite frankly, the game industry would be a better place for everyone involved if it was commercially viable and popular to throw little side projects like Overboard out there every now and then. And it certainly helps that the game itself is pretty fun to mess around with. So give Inkle some support. Critters for Sale. Critters for Sale is, ostensibly, a horror game, a collection of 5 interconnected short stories told in the point-and-click adventure format, with an artistic style designed to make you as unsettled as possible at any given moment. But that's way underselling what's going on here. In truth, Critters for Sale is less actively horrifying and more just incredibly frickin' weird. It's a game that mashes cosmic horror and Satanism together with a time-traveling Michael Jackson, that prophesies the apocalypse at the hand of a bunch of doofy aliens from Neptune. Moments of actual horror are rare, but it does have a fair number of moments that have me out of my seat going, "What? No. No way. I am being trolled right now. What the fuck?" So yeah, I guess you could say the game got a reaction out of me. Critters for Sale refuses to ever let itself be pinned down. As soon as you think you have an idea of where it's going, it takes a hard swerve in a completely different direction. It's masterful at setting an uneasy or creepy tone, but only occasionally does it follow through on its build-up. More often, the payoff of a particular short isn't a fright, but a moment of awe and mystique. Indeed, it might seem at first glance like some of these stories aren't remotely connected at all, with how wildly they vary in tone, theme, and setting, and it may feel like whatever greater narrative each individual story's vaguely gesturing at is completely esoteric and unknowable. But the deeper in you get, the more characters start popping up in multiple places, and the more the game requires you to start cross-referencing other stories to progress until you've unlocked this grand cosmic narrative of satanic prophets, alien entities beyond human understanding, and a massive shadow war in the spiritual realm. But the real breadwinner here is hands down the game's aesthetic. I think the grainy black and white video speaks for itself as an extremely effective stylistic choice for a horror game, but Critters for Sale has equally impeccable music selections. It's a pretty eclectic soundtrack, but it kinda needs to be to so perfectly capture an equally eclectic collection of stories across wildly different locales, and it never misses a beat. Overall, Critters for Sale is a fascinating slice of weird fiction with a masterful control over pacing and mood. It's a game that deals primarily in tone first and concrete narrative second, and I imagine that'll cause a few people to bounce off of it. But if you're alright with just existing in a particular mood and are willing to vibe with a piece of art, Critters for Sale will be right up your alley. Phantom Abyss. Phantom Abyss promises a lot of cool stuff. Every dungeon is its own procedurally generated series of levels that only one player can ever clear. And then it has this neat kind of sort of multiplayer aspect to it, where you're running through the level in real time with the ghosts of everybody that failed to clear it before, learning from both their triumphs and their failures. But really at its heart, Phantom Abyss is a game more about observation than sick platforming skills, and that makes it very unique amongst its peers. If you just slow down and pay attention, it's actually an incredibly easy and straightforward platformer. Hell, half the time if you stop to look around for 5 seconds, you'll notice that you don't even have to do the platforming bit, and there's a way to just go around it. But the trick to that statement is that Phantom Abyss is designed to make slowing down as difficult as possible. There's always one of a few different enemies hounding your every step, forcing you to keep moving forward, and the different ghosts of other players you're running around with provide multiple incentives to keep pace with them. So inevitably, either the carrot or the stick will motivate you to start going a little too fast, you'll walk onto an easily avoidable spike trap you would have seen if you just stopped 2 seconds to pay attention, and that's how they get you. And this is all pretty compelling. Your main way of getting around is going to be this nifty whip that lets you grapple hook all over the place, but it has a pretty hefty cooldown that reinforces the whole look before you jump mindset that the rest of the game runs off of. And a big part of the game is about discovering different secret alcoves with loot strewn about the level so you can get tokens to unlock doors and new items that modify a run. If you're here primarily for the platforming, you might feel a little let down by where Phantom Abyss places its focus. But personally, I'm really enjoying it, and I think they've made something fun and unique here. Phantom Abyss can run you far longer than 5 hours if you'd like to dive into its hardest levels, but even if later dungeons are harder, they still play the same as the earlier ones, so it's hard to say that you're missing any critical shift in gameplay if you set the game down after a few hours. It's also a game best played in shorter game sessions. An hour is enough to get 3 or 4 runs in if you're bad like me, and if you start playing much more than that, the different temples can start blending together and feel a little monotonous. There's also a mechanic that encourages this style of play, where if you die, you lose any resources you brought into the temple with you or picked up along the way. But if you wait a day for somebody else to come along and conquer the temple you died in, all those resources get unlocked and are returned to you, which encourages the player to pick away at Phantom Abyss just an hour or 2 a day. But regardless of how deeply you get sucked into Phantom Abyss, it's a promising project that could grow into something special, especially if it manages to maintain its current community. It's not perfect by any means, but it's pretty fun to explore. Before Your Eyes. Before Your Eyes starts you off in the afterlife, a dead soul fished from whatever mythological river of the dead you subscribe to, and now on your way to be judged by the god of the afterlife. And along the way, you have to tell your ferryman your life story so they can vouch for you when it's time to be judged.
Just look at him. Poor fool doesn't know what he's in for.
But the big thing going on here is Before Your Eyes' central mechanic. See, you tell your story to the boatkeeper one memory at a time, and every time you blink, you proceed to a new memory. And I mean you. The game straight up wants you to have a webcam so it can track your eyes, and every time you blink, the game moves on whether you want to or not. And that's a killer idea, gamifying the process of literally watching your entire life flash before your eyes, memories gone too soon with something as innocuous and inevitable as a blink. A lot of it is all smoke and mirrors, and it's actually incredibly difficult to miss any critical information, but that doesn't make the mechanic any less genius. There's still something to be said about using something as involuntary as blinking for your basic mechanic, about how you can't ever be fully in control of the game, and inevitably, you'll run into a point where your body betrays you and doesn't let you do what you want. Hilariously, I could keep my eyes open for minutes at a time when literally nothing was happening and the game just wanted me to move on already. But the one time it actually demanded I keep my eyes open to progress, I couldn't do it for the life of me. But there is definitely a lot that's lost if you don't at least have a webcam, and therefore the game can't detect you blinking. I personally had to work on a sort of honor system, where anytime I caught myself blinking, I had to click to progress. But even if you're like me and don't have a webcam, the game still holds up remarkably well, despite having its core mechanic ripped out. The idea itself is enough to make you self-conscious of what the game's trying to accomplish. It also doesn't hurt that everything else in Before Your Eyes outside of that one mechanic is also pretty good. The narrative beats themselves are fairly straightforward and on the generic side, but the way it's all presented is still pretty effective. Because each scene is designed around the whole blinking mechanic, it's basically mandatory that any critical information in a given scene be delivered in the first 3 seconds, and Before Your Eyes leans pretty heavily on a lot of common narrative touchstones to accomplish that. And so I'd make the same argument for Before Your Eyes that I made for Critters for Sale. The narrative itself might not be revolutionary, but this is a game that's more about tone. Because of the story's simplicity, a game that otherwise should have had a rapid-fire narrative with each scene only lasting a handful of seconds, all of a sudden has this ability to linger, to allow you to take in the vibe of a scene and just sit in it for a few seconds before you move on.
We should do this more often.
Oh, trust me, I know. With summers like this, we should be doing this every night.
If you do have access to a webcam, then this game is a must-play, and even if you don't, it's still a pretty enjoyable experience that I recommend. Okay, that's everything for this quarterly wrap-up. This entire channel is all about covering great short games like these, so if you want more, you know where to look. And if you really want to see content like this flourish, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next time.